Podcasserole. Welcome in.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast, a proud member of the Podcasserole Network. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, Peter Steepleman. How are you today?
I'm wearing my FIFA World Cup hat that I got at Goodwill.
You got it Goodwill.
I did, right. But it's new. It was like, whoa, look at this.
Somebody bought it and was like, I don't like this thing.
No, I think somebody dropped them off, and because I bought like 5 or 6 of these hats and gave them out to my kids and others, I thought, well, that'll be fun. And although it is now covering a haircut I got yesterday. And let me tell you, sometimes people tell me things that I don't know what it is, why they tell me, but my barber wanted to know whether or not he should break up with his girlfriend. And I was like,
what'd you say?
I said, tell me more, which is terrible because I probably should have said, tell me less. But he said, she's very nice and she made me a scrapbook and she's just so nice, but I'm just not sure I'm in for, maybe I'm just having a hard time with commitment. I was like, it sounds like you are following one of the more important habits of a systems thinker, which is you are avoiding the impulse to make a quick decision. Sounds like you're really thinking about this. For which he was very confused by me. He's like, what? What?
In the leadership model that I use.
That's right. Exactly. In the leadership model I use to advise others. What? But it did make me think of the fact that I don't know about you, but as a kid, I had the same barber forever. His name was Al Bertucci. And we weren't sure if his name was Al Bertucci or if it was like Al Bertucci or Albert Ucci. My friend Drew used to say it could be like A. Bertucci.
Oh, that's true.
Bertucci, right? So who knows? At any rate, he was the best, and he was so funny, and he was smart, and I've been in the sort of perpetual search for that kind of barber relationship. But who knows?
Do you think? So I too went to the same barber, and now growing up, and then now go to the same barber that at least has been 10 years, right? 2016, probably at least 10 years, if not more, that I've been going to the same barber. I wonder how consistent that is for folks. It definitely, as it relates to our guest, Dr. James Lane, who has had a lot of experience across multiple different systems. The smaller the town, the more likely you're going to know the person who's cutting your hair.
Yeah. That's true. The relationships are real and they're enduring and they are generational, right?
100%.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
My grandfather brought me to the barber every single time. My barber had 2 choices for haircuts. You could get a crew cut or a flat top. Those were the 2 choices. I pretty much always went crew cut. The flat top took longer.
Oh my gosh. You were an antsy kid, I bet.
I was 100. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I was bouncing all over the place. And yeah.
That makes me think whether or not you opted for crew cut. Or they were like, you know what you're getting?
But it felt like my choice.
It's charitable that you're like, oh, I know. I just couldn't take too long. They're like, not an option for you, buddy.
Not an option. Here's a lollipop. Go wait over there.
I actually like that. I mean, so James Lane, who was the acting assistant secretary of education at the federal level, he was the superintendent for the state of Virginia. These are high level positions. And he talked about, though, the intentional decision, because I asked him about it, but the intentional decision early in his career where he went and worked in a rural district where he had to drive a considerable distance to get there and how you had to really become this high-level generalist. And I love that about this experience. You don't get those experiences in the big district, is what he said. And we talk about boots in the ground. He's like, boots in the mud. And it was that boots in the mud experience that allowed him to lead a larger system. I do want to get into it more. He talks about some other things that I think superintendents are really going to find, and leaders all over are going to find interesting and pertinent and relevant. So if it's all right, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. I just want to say you are hitting on the very thing that I want to talk about. And that's what I'm going to encourage people to listen for is this evolution that he went through as he became a leader, the multiple different types of experiences he's had. And it probably resonates with me because I am such a proponent for doing it all. Taking a minute to do it all. Rushing to be the superintendent after having taught for 2 years and then been the AD for 2 years before you're now assistant soup to soup. I'm like, take a minute, learn the things, because there is so much a wealth of wisdom that comes with those experiences, Allows you to understand where the system fails.
So I want you to listen he has a definition for innovation. And I'm just going to say, because I think about our sponsor, iExcel, he says that innovation can't just be newer, it needs to be better. And that's what I think about with iExcel. It's this research proven platform that provides a laser focus for your schools. And it replaces dozens of disconnected tools with this one system. So take the load off your teachers. Ensure that your students can outperform on state tests with personalized learning that actually moves the needle. It is not just newer, it is better. So visit ixl.com/imperfect today. All right, you're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent's Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Almanzon, and we'll see you on the other side.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Dr. James F. Lane, the author of Leading with Laser Focus and a former acting assistant secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, whose leadership journey from classroom band director to Virginia's superintendent of public instruction has been defined, I think it would be best to say, by this unwavering commitment to being a voice for students, as well as really staying grounded in the needs of those closest to the classroom. So James, acting assistant secretary, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you. So glad to be here with you, Peter.
I'm really, really, really happy to meet you. And as you can imagine, I have a lot of questions for you, a lot of ways that this conversation could go. But if it's okay, I actually want to ask you a question about an intentional, I think you've described it as the intentional professional shift that you made, something that you've referred to as one of the best decisions of your career. And that was moving from a large suburban district to a much smaller rural community in Middlesex. And that's all despite the long commute and all the fewer resources and all of that. And there are leaders who are listening who are faced with a very similar decision and even might see it as moving sideways or even a step down, which I think is totally the wrong way to think about it. And I imagine you will agree. What did this rural experience teach you about leadership? And then especially when thinking about the vantage point necessary for national leadership.
There's so much about that decision that I'm thankful for. And I'll tell just a brief story of how I came to make that decision, because I know a lot of leaders, superintendents ask me all the time, like, the small rural community next door is open, but I really want to be superintendent in my big suburban urban community. What do you think about me making that move? And one thing I can say is having experience as a superintendent is super important to being a great superintendent. That doesn't mean that you can't gain that experience in your first superintendency. Obviously, we all have to have a first, but I have found that amongst the most successful superintendents I know are folks that cut their teeth in smaller and medium-sized districts. And the thing about Middlesex, there's only 1,200 kids in that community. Later in my career, I was a superintendent of a district with 70,000 students, nearly 70,000 students. And the thing about being a superintendent in a school district of 1,200 is you do every job.
Oh my gosh. I talked to Melissa Sadorf last week.
Yeah.
Melissa, the National Rural Education Association Executive Director. And that's exactly what I noted and what she reminded me of. They do everything. They set the tax rate. They drive the bus. They'll fix the refrigerator. They have to figure it all out. And that's something that I was in a district of 19,000. So there were a lot of people who did those kinds of things. And I don't think I ever really learned how to do some of those things. And I imagine when you moved to this rural district, you learned how to do it all.
Oh yeah. I was the HR guy. I did finance. I did special education. I did instruction. I did curriculum. And I'll never forget, we were revamping our athletic complex, which was one of the bigger construction projects they had done in decades. And when we were deciding to buy the land, I'm literally out there with boots on, walking through the mud to assess the quality of the dirt that we're going to build our stadium on.
Oh my gosh.
You know, you don't get that experience in the big district. And one of the things I found is it taught me to be more detail oriented. I knew all those facets. So when I got to a slightly bigger district, Goochland next, and then eventually Chesterfield, which was the really, really large district, when people asked me a question, I knew the answer because I had done their job. And that was huge. And then the question I get all the time is, what about the 90-minute commute? And it's the only superintendency I had where they didn't make me live in the community. But I was a principal there. I was an assistant superintendent there. They knew I was committed to the community. And what I will say is Marcus Newsom is a superintendent. He's retired from Virginia. He was Chesterfield superintendent before me. After he retired, he decided to go run Petersburg, which is the most challenging school district at the time in Virginia. Now he's retired again and gone to Maryland, and he's superintendent in Calvert, Maryland. But Marcus was superintendent in Chesterfield. And on his very first day, I was in doctoral school to become a superintendent. very first day in Chesterfield, his very first meeting was with me. And we had a great conversation. And in that conversation, he asked me what I wanted to do with my career. I said, I want to be the next superintendent in Chesterfield. And he said a funny thing to me. He said, you're going to have to leave to come back. And that stuck with me. And when the Middlesex opportunity came to be principal, the decision to go be a principal there versus staying in my much larger community was partially driven by that belief that I'm going to have to get a superintendency first. And I'm more likely to do that in a small and rural school district. And frankly, the superintendent at the time told me that if I came and I was successful, he'd make me the assistant superintendent, which ended up being true. And I never looked back. I got the experience. I did every single job. The drive was brutal every day, but funny things happened in that like we couldn't recruit teachers all the way out there. So I basically started commuting.
You were carpooling? You were like a carpooling
and driving them out there.
Yeah.
And so I was like training them in the car about what you need to know about being a teacher. And
that's amazing. I imagine your district had like a sponsored park and drive.
Yeah.
You were there.
Oh, yeah, totally. That was my rule. If you're at my house, I'll drive you to work. And
that's amazing. Yeah. Oh, I like that. That actually brings me to I want to talk about your book, because I imagine in this work that you were doing that it sort of you learn sort of these foundational pieces around focus. And so your book, Leading with Laser Focus, the 7 Steps to School Success. When I was a superintendent, I had a board member who did everything right, would praise me publicly for stating where our focus had to be. And then in private would say, hey, Peter, you're focused on 8 things. And when you're focused on 8 things, you're focused on nothing. And I can remember even now how defensively I responded, but he was right. And so in this era where principals and superintendents and state superintendents, and then at the national level, although we're not going to go there, but let's just say like we're all pulled in 1,000 different directions. And so I wonder, how do you practically maintain this laser focus on the 7 steps without succumbing to really what becomes initiative fatigue?
No, totally. It's something I think about all the time. And in fact, earlier in my career, the same thing. Like I would have a million initiatives and people would be like, don't you think that's too much? I'm like, we can walk and chew gum. And it took experience and time for me to say, no, we got to keep the main things the main thing. And the main thing is we should have high expectations for our students, and we should have high expectations for the folks that work with us. And we should try to get the best outcomes for our kids. And as a leader, one of the things that took me a while to realize, none of us would be here. There'd be no board. There'd be no superintendent. There'd be no principal if there weren't a teacher and a student. And frankly, if there weren't many teachers and many students that needed a system. And so our job is to be there as a steward to that teaching and learning moment. And therefore, we have to create systems that maximize those outcomes for students. And so for me, I started to move off of the initiative fatigue issues and going after everything, and instead decided, okay, I led a school from some grade levels had 50% pass rates to 90% pass rates. That's all in the book. And I started thinking about what were the things that actually made a difference there. And let's scale and replicate that across our district as we become superintendent. And let's stop focusing on the things that don't matter. And let's find a way to make teachers' lives easier. And that's what it came for me. And then as time went on and I replicated that in more and more schools that weren't accredited, I got them accredited. And I went to Chesterfield, and the first day they were like, hey, 2 of our schools aren't going to be accredited for the first time. And I'm like, okay, I'm the new soup. I know how to fix that. And those same type of things worked there. It became clear to me that, okay, if we can hone in on these things, we can be successful in it. If we go through the steps later, one of the things I'll talk about is you can't just do one of the steps and say, oh, I'm doing one of the steps and it's going to be fine. It's a system. It's about doing it together and all of it working in harmony, and one thing flows to the next. And that's what people miss is inside the steps are common assessment and aligned curriculum and interventions. Yeah, every school is doing those things, but you're not thinking about how you put it in place so that everyone in the school knows exactly what happens when a kid starts to show failure.
You're talking about clarity and you're talking about cohesion, and I love it. I do want to get there. I do want to know, you said when you first got there about we can walk and chew gum, and I can remember a principal, I went to go visit a school and a principal asked me to step into her office and we were chatting, and she closed the door intentionally to show all the lists of things that we had been talking about. And she just said, look at all these initiatives. Like nobody knows where to start. And it really was I'm so glad that she had the courage or the willingness to be clear, that clear as kind of thing. And it really helped me sort of reshift on, okay, what is it that we're focused on? And I realized that I was leading with these sort of platitudes. And you actually mentioned that in your book, Shattering These Educational Platitudes. And then in the world of school leadership, there are a lot of ways that we try to make people feel good. And we have these sayings and they don't translate into anything. And your book really speaks to shifting us out of platitudes and really into action. And so I'd like, maybe if you wouldn't mind, would you talk about maybe one of those common educational platitudes that you think really do hinder real school transformation and maybe what we should be saying or doing instead?
There's many platitudes, but the one that comes top of mind is every leader claims that they're innovative. And innovation is, I work in the private side now, and we want to talk about how our products are innovative and then not getting into the politics of everything going on in ed tech right now and all of that stuff that's happening nationally. Every ed tech product is supposed to be the next great innovation that's going to change things. And what I decided is we should have a very clear definition of what it means to be innovative. And I think if we had that, folks would stop with some of the platitudes. And oftentimes it's the flavor of the day too. Like do I think that high quality instructional materials are important? Absolutely. But just because your vendor says it's HQIM doesn't mean it's high quality. But the part that gets lost in that conversation is it's also not about having high quality instructional materials. It's about using them the way that they were intended and with the effective guides that come with that lead to the outcomes that they claim. And so for me,
oh my gosh, you're just making me think about how every school I've ever seen says, yeah, but they're not like us. We needed to do it differently. Or can you show me a school that's exactly our demographics that have had success like we had? Otherwise, I think we need to do it differently.
Yeah, totally. But so I define innovation super simply, and it is that which is newer and better. And what I will tell you is in education, we tend to get caught up in what's newer and forget to actually make sure it's better. And that is the platitude that I'm most trying to shatter is don't get caught up as a new superintendent going after the new shiny thing that everybody's talking about until you've actually assessed, is it better for teaching and learning? Is it better for our students? Is it going to change their outcomes? And that is my biggest fear when I see leaders talking about being innovative is, yes, you get some pretty good press in the education community because the real press doesn't report on these things per se, but you might get a great notoriety in the field. But I will tell you, you won't really grow in this education field unless you're getting outcomes with kids. And you always end up getting caught if you're not actually making things better.
I love it. If you're just joining us, my guest today is Dr. James F. Lane, the former Superintendent of the Year for Virginia, former Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education, and the author of Leading with Laser Focus. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called nested patterns, and it really speaks to this question of like, how will we be together? And the dimension has a few components, one being shared leadership. And in your career, in following it, I've heard you state that at every step of your journey, and you've even mentioned it in our conversation today, that your job was to be the voice for students when no one else would be thinking about them. Shared leadership means that we are willing to share decision-making with all levels of leadership, especially the people most impacted, kids. And you've really had these important roles, Acting Assistant Secretary of Education. You've said something very similar to what I just said, which is that those closest to the kids, parents and teachers, they make the best decisions. And so when you were working as part of the federal government, what were some ways that you ensure that you were making decisions collaboratively or in a shared decision model and as opposed to an isolation? And you're making decisions with and for people everywhere from Oklahoma City to rural Nevada to these matter. And so I'm just really curious in the approach that you took, the process you used. How'd you do it?
Yeah, it's
just a small question.
It's a great question. The first answer to that is, and whether you're the federal leader of education or whether state superintendent, district superintendent, or principal, the first thing that I always say to leaders is make sure you're actually spending time in schools. And I can't tell you how many superintendents will take the Twitter picture, the LinkedIn picture, and tell everybody about the school they visited. And you don't see another picture for a couple months. And I was very intentional as a principal. I went to every classroom in my school every day. When I was a superintendent, I went to a school every day. when I became state superintendent, I made a commitment that I would visit every single school district in Virginia while I was state superintendent. And that was during COVID when we weren't even really allowed to go for
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I don't know if you crossed paths with Stephen Prue when he was in Kentucky, but he had a very similar. I love Stephen, and he's been on our program as well. Is that right? I sense that just by in talking with you just now and listening to you. I'm like, man, these guys are like two peas in a pod, or so aligned in the way that they think about teachers and kids in schools.
Yeah, but even when I went to the federal level, where it was a little harder to get out because you're policy making in Washington, budgets and everything else, but I made that same commitment. I was on the road a ton. Inside my team at the U.S. Department of Ed, I ran the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed, and we had the crisis response team. So if there was a school shooting, we had a team that responded. And so when the floods happened in Kentucky, I went out there, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so for me, staying grounded in what's actually happening in schools is super important. Now, in my private business, we actually help with work in schools, and I try to spend as much time there as I can. The second thing that I did in Washington is, as acting assistant secretary, I had the ability to build out my team. And so every interview with everyone that was going to come set policy in elementary and secondary education, I wanted to make sure they were grounded in what was important for schools. And my team was built intentionally to make sure that in the broad federal government, we were the voice of what's going on in schools. There might be policymakers in other offices or in the OCTAE, which was CTE, or the special ed team or the higher ed team or whatever. Regardless of who was making decisions, our team was going to make decisions that were best for schools and kids. But then, for me, you talked about the quote that I have about being an advocate or voice for students. To do that is actually harder than you think. And I can remember as a superintendent feeling the pressure to support my principals and what they wanted, maybe over students and parents or teachers. And I wasn't going to do that, right? I was going to stand up for that teaching and learning moment. So I'm going to stand up for my students first. Then I'm going to stand up for my teachers. They are the closest to the students, of course, the parents. And so then you get to be the state superintendent and you get a lot of pressure to do what the superintendents want to do.
That's exactly right.
You get to be at the federal level and you get a lot of pressure to do what the states want to do. And ultimately, it's funny, and I don't tell a lot of stories about my time in federal service because there's always people that have opinions on that. But I felt like a lot of times when I was in that role, my job was to make sure I was providing a voice for students, make good policy decisions, but I spent an unbelievable amount of time making sure we didn't make bad decisions because there are a lot of policymakers in Washington that have never worked in a school. A lot of policymakers in Washington, their policymaking job is the first job they've ever had at the junior levels of the administration. And so I felt like my role in the federal government was to make sure that everybody knew what was going on in schools. And so if you still overrode me and the White House made a decision that was maybe antithetical to what I wanted, at least everybody knew what students, parents, principals, teachers, superintendents, states wanted. And if they still made the decision, then okay, then they must have a really good reason for it.
That's helpful to understand. I'm thinking about something you said earlier about your book and how it is about a system, not individual pieces. And then you've just sort of reiterated that right now with you have to think about all the different people who are going to be impacted by that decision and then bring that perspective to those who may overrule you or say, thank you for bringing this perspective because we were about to fall victim to the impulse of making a quick decision without considering the unintended consequences of that decision. That's really hard work. It seems like that would be really good advice for any of us, whatever level that we're at, whether it be teacher in classroom, principal, assistant superintendent, and then all the way, I don't say up because they're just different roles. They have maybe greater reach. But and it's a very highly politicized climate that we're in, is to see how you can slow it down to really take into consideration the very different perspectives that people are bringing to a problem.
And part of what drove me is during the times where I was principal, superintendent, state superintendent, I had little kids in schools. My kids now are one in high school, one in middle school. But throughout most of my superintendency, they were elementary students. And I was on the ball field with the parents that didn't like the decision that I or the board made.
Oh my gosh. And they all say, you have a second? You're like, I just want to watch my kid play. And he's not very good.
Sometimes and the neighborhood folks would walk their dog past my house, hoping I'd be outside so they could ask me that question, right? And I tried to always be available for that. But the fact that I had kids in schools was big to me because I felt like I had a very unique perspective of what was going on every day. And, my kids had great teachers and they had some average teachers. And I won't say that my kids ever had any bad teachers because I love my community. But what I will say is it kept me grounded in that as I'm making all these decisions, federal or whatever, how would this impact my own child? And that was huge for me. I was certainly advocating for all kids, but the fact that I could actually ask my kids at dinner, hey, if the assessments changed and you had to do your end of year assessments this way, how would you feel about that? And they'd be like, why do we even have these assessments, Dad?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And you're like, that's actually a much longer meal. And so
we'll do that.
We'll have to table that for now. Yeah. The funny one for me is that my kid's high school quote was, no, I don't know if we're having a snow day. People would like nonstop be texting him.
I had to tell my kids last.
Yeah.
My kids, I was calling for snow. It would get out before I had a chance to
Of course. That's why he would literally say, I don't know. I never knew. You'd think I had the inside track. I did. Let me ask you a question that I've asked every guest who comes on the podcast. And I think for you, it's even more relevant because you've shared a quote about focusing not on being the best, but on being the best at getting better. And James, how does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
It does resonate. And I got to give a little bit of credit to that quote to my buddy, Thomas Taylor, who's the superintendent in Montgomery, Maryland, because he was my assistant superintendent in Chesterfield. And I was really pushing on this thing. And he was like, don't wait for perfection. Let's be the best at getting better and not try to be the best from the onset. And I was like, I'm going to use that everywhere I go.
I love it.
But no leader is perfect. And I can look back on my career. I'm super proud of every step of my journey, but I can look back at every step and tell you some very specific times where I wish I had done that differently. Or sometimes it's not even differently. It's, I wish I knew what I knew now when I was making that decision. Especially during COVID, because I was making the decisions based on what I was being told by supposed experts at the time and making those decisions based on that data. And so that's a grace that I always give leaders is it is so easy to look back with 20/20 hindsight. And so what I judge leaders by is if I had the same information you had at the same time you make the decision, did you make the best decision for kids and teachers? And I tried to always do that. But I made mistakes and I called it wrong sometimes. And it's helped me grow in my career. And every time I felt like I wish I had done something different, it has propelled me forward the next time that came up, or even a similar version of it coming up, to be so much better in the way that I decided. But the other thing that making mistakes does, everybody learns from mistakes, right? But the other thing that it does is it taught me over the years to bring more and more voices into the decision, because those hindsight moments are like, if you had known what I knew, you would have done that differently. Then I need to make sure you're in the room the next time I make that decision. And so that was another piece about being imperfect is if you are humble enough to recognize that you're imperfect, then you're going to surround yourselves with people who fulfill your imperfections so that you can be as close to perfect as a team as possible, because no one individual is ever going to be perfect.
Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an imperfect leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class. And the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class. I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. So I want to talk a minute about the Mosaic Project. It is one of our favorite organizations and has over 25 years of experience empowering students to really celebrate differences, communicate assertively, and resolve conflict peacefully at their outdoor school. I happen to have experience being part of the Mosaic Project, and so I can absolutely tell you it's an amazing organization. Their innovative SEL curriculum is now available to our Imperfect Leader audience. And so you can get a 10% discount through their new documentary film-based Mosaic Classroom project. So just let the people know during your onboarding process to receive that 10% discount is to just mention an Imperfect Leader. Learn more about the Mosaic Project at mosaicproject.org.
When leaders think in systems, they think differently. They see the big picture, making decisions that create coherence and strengthen communication across their teams. They build adaptability, flexibility, and engagement. Every day, school leaders face complex challenges, from student engagement to staff alignment. What if your team could see those challenges as part of a bigger picture? That's what happens when you think in systems. It's how leaders turn complexity into connection and challenges into opportunities for growth. At the Waters Center for Systems Thinking, we help educators and organizations build this capacity, developing the habits and tools that turn vision into action. Think differently, think in systems. Sign up for our webinars, free resources, or a consultation by visiting our website, which you can find in the show notes.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action, and my guest today is Dr. James F. Lane, the former Superintendent of the Year for Virginia, former Acting Assistant Secretary of the Department of Education, and the author of Leading with Laser Focus. And so, just like we do every week in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they made, and then we talk about what they learned. So, what happened?
So, as I've been thinking about how to answer that question, there are decisions that I made for sure that, with the information that I had at the time, I felt like it was the right decision. So I'm gonna ignore those because those are probably the bigger ones everyone would expect me to say, because I can't change what I knew at the time. But more want to talk about it from a framework of like how I learned from it. And so I'll give an example. When I was state superintendent, we were having a debate about where to set the cut scores on the state assessment. And I wanted to raise the cut scores. And we knew that superintendents wouldn't like it. We knew that raising the cut scores meant that student results were going to go down and that there would be more schools not accredited. But I felt like when I was looking at the NAEP data, and this trends before I got there, of course, it got worse for everybody post-COVID. And I was looking at the data, and our standards weren't aligned to NAEP, but at the same time, we were always one of the higher performing NAEP states. And I just felt like I could see Virginia students' performance slipping. And I just thought, okay, we should raise the standard. And we had there's a methodology they use to decide how to set cut scores. It's called the Angoff method. And I'm going to oversimplify this. I am not a psychometrician, but what the Angoff method essentially says is you take people who are experts in that subject, grade level, whatever, they take the assessments and then tell you what indicates passing for a student. And you do enough of those that you aggregate and average it. And then that should be the cut score. So a bunch of third grade teachers take this, so on and so forth. And then there's always debates is there bias? Do the teachers want the students' results to be more? And do they, and what we found is that generally speaking, our teachers are professionals and they kind of landed where we wanted them to land. And I don't remember all the details now because it's been some years, but essentially that the teachers either wanted to keep the cut score flat or reduce it down a little bit, and which would have made student results in Virginia potentially better. And I just felt, no, we shouldn't be lowering the bar for kids. And so I was huge on let's raise it up. And I think I actually wanted to raise it even beyond what the recommendation was. And so anyways, it gets to the board, and a lot of times as a superintendent, I will have one-on-one conversations with my board members and walk them through the agenda before we have the actual meeting. They don't pre-decide anything. They don't meet in groups. That's against law, right? But I'm allowed to meet with them one-on-one. And as it related to this item, with the state board, we didn't do that as much like school boards do. These 9 folks would come together every couple months. And other than the chair, I didn't really have one-on-one conversations with everybody. And I had a misconception that everybody was going to be all in on raising expectations for kids. And when the debate happened, there were principals on the board, there were superintendents on the board, there were advocates on the board, formers, I should say. One of them was current, but anyways, and they got into groupthink. And I remember that they finally decided to put the cut score where they wanted it. It was lower than what I wanted. I can't remember exactly how low in comparison to the previous standard. Like all of that's in the past now, but they made that decision. And I remember right before they were going to take the vote, I said, I don't remember the exact words, but it's something along the lines of, please don't do this. We can't be known for lowering standards. And
was that the quote in every paper in the state?
No.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Cut scores don't make the news usually, right? And so that they passed the cut score that they wanted. And it wasn't very long after that I moved on to the federal level and all of that. And so my role, once the board passes something, is to support what the board passed.
And communicate it with enthusiasm.
With enthusiasm. And I won't say I did it with enthusiasm, but I communicated the results. And exactly what I said was going to happen happened. Student results improved the next year. This was a new assessment. And usually new assessments have a major decline. And then NAEP results got worse. But I didn't go out there and don't necessarily think that this part of it was wrong. But I didn't go out there and say the decision they made was against my recommendation. Instead, I was like, the board has decided, here's what we're moving forward. And then they had a political party change and all that. And for years, folks were complaining about how my administration lowered the cut scores and then used that as fuel to make other changes that some are great and some are average.
Well, that's what I want to talk about a little bit, is get into the unintended consequence of something like this and what got overlooked in those pieces. I will mention, so probably about 75% of our audience is the United States, so they understand that every state in the union has a requirement by the federal government to administer an annual test, and that the states then, their boards of education set what are called cut scores in terms of what's considered advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic, however they may be identified. And so for those who are listening in Singapore, in Colombia, in Vietnam, for which we have a large audience, just wanted to make that clear, because in those countries, the federal government sets it all, and that's it. They have the national standards, national curriculum, national cut scores. So we have states' rights in the United States, and so each of those states have a requirement, but they interpret it their own way. And so some states will set a very low cut score as a way to sort of be able to celebrate, look how many of our students are advanced and proficient. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's true, but they see it as a way maybe to pacify the public, to maybe see it as a way to recruit businesses to their states, to say, look, we have a highly prepared workforce that's graduating high school. Other states, it sounds like what you were trying to do in Virginia. Missouri is actually one of them as well. Massachusetts is often seen as the leader in having much higher cut scores as a way to say, yeah, we could create this false positive that says that everyone's doing well. Actually, we'd rather be really honest about what are we doing well, and then keep working towards getting better at it. And it sounds like your perspective was like, let's actually raise the standard of the cut score so that we can be assured that the kids are getting the kind of education we want for our own children. That sound fairly accurate in terms of your perspective? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge believer that you don't want to make the bar inappropriate. I always use a metaphor of like a weightlifter. You always want to be lifting about 10% more than you can lift, and that's how you get stronger. Now, if you can only lift 100 pounds, if I give you 250, that's a waste of time, right?
Yeah.
But we should be raising the bar and pushing, and kids, as long as it's not inappropriately high, kids rise to the standard.
They'll meet your expectations. Yeah. They'll meet your low expectations. They'll meet your high expectations.
Absolutely. And so I'm a big believer in that. And that I have found that everywhere I set expectations higher, as long as it wasn't inappropriate, folks get there. They get there.
Okay. So then you had this process. You went through it. It sounds like you engaged lots of voices. The one piece that I'm sort of keying in on is where you typically have had the opportunity as a superintendent to meet with individual board members to answer questions purely for information, not to ask them or to sway them how they're going to vote, but rather to make sure that the conversation they're going to have ultimately is a well-informed one. It sounds like what may have gotten overlooked is that you didn't have that opportunity to do something similar with your state board. Is that true?
Yeah, I wish I had done more of that. Certainly had some conversations, and even at the dais, we had very robust conversation on it. But what I didn't prepare them for was the unintended consequence. I said it very quickly at the end, right before they voted.
Don't do it.
and they were like, I felt like they felt like I was quipping because I was upset that they were going against my recommendation. But downstream, and I think the new administration came in and made some great decisions on accountability and assessment. And I think those are going to continue. Now we've had another administration change. Virginia only has one-term governors. But I don't think they were prepared for, once they made that decision, the folks that believe in higher standards like me, I don't think they were prepared for the backlash that was going to come with that. And that's my thing. And not only do I wish I prepared them for the vote and how to think about higher standards and all of that, I wish I had prepared them for the way that people were going to talk about it after it was over.
Oh, that's interesting. So that gets to what you could have done differently. Before I ask you that, to maybe unpack that a little bit in terms of what you would have done. Let me back up to one question that I typically ask about. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed as a result of this?
That's a great question. It was tough for me in that specific scenario because I went to the federal government shortly thereafter because, when you make decisions as a principal, people hear that decision the next day. When you make decisions as a superintendent, they probably hear it within the week. When you make a decision at the state, it might be a few months before that really trickles down in practice to everyone. And in this case, when you're talking about cut scores, it's not until the reporting of the very next testing cycle, and you're usually making cut score decisions a year before the assessment. I was preparing them for a moment that was 16 months away. And it's so easy to make a decision 16 months earlier, not knowing the impact of what it's going to be like in 16 months, especially in some cases where you're not there. And I think that had I stayed, I wish that I had an opportunity to communicate why we had the position we had, why the board had the position that they had. They lost the ability to communicate that at all because they were no longer seated in the seats, and it was new board members, administration,
gotcha.
and all that. And that's maybe the lesson for superintendents is the decisions you make when you leave and a new superintendent comes in, you have no control over how they take your initiative forward. And oftentimes new superintendents, and especially state new governments, new governors, new general assemblies, they're going to do what they think is right. And just like you didn't want to be Monday morning quarterbacked on your decision when you're there, it's not a great idea for you as a leader after you leave to go and point fingers at why aren't you doing it the way that I did it. If you wanted to, you could have stayed. Right? You know what I mean? And that's a lesson for leaders that's super tough. And I struggle with it. When I leave an organization, I feel so invested in, like, I made all these decisions, and or when they disagreed with me, I want people to know why I recommended what I recommended and why they were
Right.
And I find that so many times that leaders have a hard time letting go of the past. And that's something I've learned with age for sure. But, what I try to do with leaders is when I'm gone and I'm in my new role, you can always call me and I'll always tell you why I made the decisions I made. Or in this case, I wish folks would call me and say, why did the board make that decision? I could be like, actually, we were thinking about it this way and they went that way. And that's the lesson I learned the most, is that once I'm gone, it's not my responsibility. I'm there to be a resource, but I have no control over how it's handled.
I think that's really good advice, particularly because we're ending our 4th season. So we've done maybe 160, 170 of episodes. And typically we're always talking about the transition into the role. And you're the first superintendent who has talked about when you leave, how do you do that with grace? How do you do that recognizing there will be some pieces that really are your legacy and others for which legacy hasn't been established? And so there will be changes, and how you respond and how you react to that and how you handle and navigate that also takes skill. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. That's really, really important. In the end, we typically ask what was something that was good that came out of this situation. And I imagine that something good that came out of it really is about subsequent decision-making and how you went about doing that.
Yeah. And I would say I always try to shy from political talk because I always tried to be the voice of students, and students don't have.
And I really
political
appreciate
party.
it. I tried to
Yeah.
stay away from like, how nutty is this situation right now? Because that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
Really, what's more, because that's sort of like driving past an accident and just gawking at it. Really, I'm interested in what you've been talking about this entire conversation, really about how do we make sure that kids have the very best chances?
Yeah. But what I learned from it was, whereas I disagreed with, I recommended something different, right? Disagree is a different word when you work for the boards and the governors, right? But, I made a different recommendation. They made their decision. And then later that got questioned, and after I was gone. And the good thing that came out of it, and what I learned from it, is there's always an opportunity to course correct. And it's a huge mistake that I think leaders make, is that it goes back to my definition of innovation. It's actually got to be newer and better, right? And what if it's not better, but you've been out in the media telling everybody about your big innovation? So many times leaders won't let it go, and they keep doing the thing that's actually not better because it's quote unquote part of their legacy, or it's the thing they've been telling everybody. And actually what I've learned in private business is that the best thing you can do as a leader is eliminate bad ideas as quickly as possible. It's okay to try things. There's a Jim Collins phrase that fire bullets before you fire cannonball. Try a bunch of things. And the metaphor is that two battleships, and the one firing bullets knew how close they were because the bullets, then they fired the cannonballs, they won, whatever. But the point is, I don't mind superintendents that try a lot of things as long as they believe they're going to be newer and better. But when it's not better, it is so hard to say, I was wrong and let's get off of it and let's move on. And in business, if you don't do that, you're going to cost your company money, and your investors and everyone else that's involved are just really going to detest that. And so quickly eliminating bad initiatives is huge in the business world. I don't think we're as great at that in education. And in this case, what I learned from it is they made this decision that I recommended something different. New administration came in, completely disagreed with it, was very vocal about that. But then they had a governor with a different party that was the General Assembly. And ultimately, they came to a bipartisan resolution. I think now they have a better accountability and assessment system, and they have high standards for students. And I think this is going to lead to better outcomes for Virginia. But I think that what I wish I had done is gotten more bipartisan voices when we were making those decisions, and we might have avoided what happened after I left and the disagreements, because I don't think this had to be political. Raising standards for students should be something that we all want.
Our guest today was Dr. James F. Lane, former Superintendent of the Year for Virginia, also the Superintendent for the state of Virginia, the former Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education, and the author of Leading with Laser Focus, for which we will put a link in our show notes so that people can find you and your book. Thank you so much, James. I really, really am grateful for your time, your energy, your service, obviously, and thanks. I really appreciate the time.
I have really enjoyed being here. Thank you for having me.
All right, Jamie, we are back.
I want to start with the small rural leadership, his experience in the small rural leadership leading to exceptional systems leaders. He said this, actually, I really related to this. He said, I was the HR guy. I did finance. I did special ed. I did instruction. I did curriculum. He did everything. And he said he was literally out when they were deciding whether to buy land for the new stadium. He's out there walking through the mud, right? To wonder whether is this the right dirt. And people have heard me tell this story about being asked about going to look at, I was an AP and going to look at the HVAC system. And they're like, something's wrong. And I'm like, yep, let's go look at it. And as I'm walking out there, I'm like, A, I don't know where it is. B, what am I going to do? I don't even know. I don't know how my own HVAC system works, let alone this one that is for the
You walk out
building.
there. Look, I don't have you got latex gloves on? No. I wish I could help you guys today.
It's all ball bearings.
You
these
know
days.
what? It's all. That's a Fletch comment? That's a
That's
Fletch
a
sledge?
Fletch comment.
Yeah. Well done.
Yeah, so that I really related to that. I loved the conversation about multiple different experiences. And you've heard me say, I'm one of the few. I taught every single grade level. I started in elementary. I taught high school. I taught middle school. And I've done so many different kinds of jobs in the public system that it lets me better understand how the system works.
Yeah.
I approach this from a place of like, I see all the intricacies and see the gaps in communication that consistently happen, regardless of the state or the town. Smaller is always better, but doesn't necessarily guarantee it's going to run better for sure. And I guess my question is, what was your experience with that? Because you worked in big districts. You were in Oakland.
Yeah, I'll tell you that. So I can remember we did soil samples on a new elementary school that we were building, and they all seemed fine. And then as they're going out to now pour concrete and start going, and they're drilling down. I don't even know what they're doing, but basically they discover actually the soil is not as solid as they thought. And so then that creates a major change order because now they have to drill even deeper for, to get to
bedrock,
solid, to that solid ground. And knowing that now, of course, that would make me a better superintendent if I'm advising someone who's building to be like, oh, when they are drilling to do soil samples, what does that grid look like? Or how do they describe it? Or what is their responsibility should they have done the work and then it reveals that actually there's some substandard soil and, they're fine. None of those things ever occurred to me. And at least you have a body of knowledge now. So I would say lots of things like that happened about roofs, had the kind of roofing material, how that expands and contracts based on the weather. And so we had a building where it just kept popping, like pop all the time because whatever they put on the sub level was just substandard. And so those things happen. And unfortunately, we didn't catch it. And so to be in this position, so I think about James, who had to be so intimately familiar as a small town superintendent, as a rural superintendent. And that isn't necessarily what larger superintendents, they have people who do that. That's their expertise. And that's not to say that you need to be inserting your head into all that stuff. But having had the experience, it made him so much more capable when he was then leading larger districts and larger systems.
Totally. And I think one thing that's true about James is that he talks about this in his definition for an imperfect leader, and that he's humble. So he doesn't come from a place of, I did everything as a rural superintendent, therefore I know everything. Rather, he says, it gave me at least a foundation to know, geez, I really don't know. What am I doing out here in the dirt? That part, I think, is what's really helpful. It brought wisdom, and he brought that experience and wisdom to the bigger job. And I think it helped him better understand how the system worked.
And I love the fact that you highlighted that he talks about being humble. I think his quote is, if you're humble enough to recognize that you're imperfect, then you're going to surround yourself with the people who fulfill your imperfections. And I've wanted to say that in that way for the last couple of weeks. The different guests we've had, and throughout this entire season, we've had a lot of rural leaders or executive directors for rural leaders. And I really appreciate that because they represent the vast majority of school districts in North America, rural districts, the number of districts. And that is exactly the kind of definition I would hope to sort of share, is like surrounding yourself with people who fulfill your imperfections. Oh my God, that makes you a more complete and perfect team. And so that's where I would also say, like, he's got a knack for coming up with definitions. So before we went in, I talked about the definition that he used for innovation, which is that innovation is super simple. And it's that which is newer and better. That's it. And he says, what I'll tell you is in education, we tend to get caught up in what's newer and we forget to actually make sure it's better. That's embarrassing and true.
100%. I think it's the same thing we fall for every single time in the tyranny of the urgent. One thing that I'd be interested in knowing from James is, as he brings more voices in the room in order to create a closer to perfect team, an imperfect leader, but a perfect team, he's filling in these things that he doesn't know. That's going to take longer. More people means it takes longer. That's good. You'll get better decisions as a result of that. But school systems run at a pace that's absurd. It's always the tyranny of the urgent. It's always whatever is on top is the thing that's getting addressed. And so it makes me wonder, A, no wonder we just buy things that are new. That makes sense. B, what does it take to know when it's better? Like, how do you know? Because he said that. He said it has to be better for kids and learning. And I'm like, okay, some of these things you don't actually know. You have
when
their presentation.
when you don't provide clarity on what you're trying to achieve, then you buy the next shiny thing. Oh, we need to go 1-to-1. Oh, we need this. Oh, we need this. Ooh, we need that. And I was thinking about our district. We were one of these early adopters on MyOn Reader. And so MyOn Reader provides a digital library. And so that's new. That's really exciting. And so kids had iPads and they could access books. And at the end of the book, you could take a quiz. And I don't know how many kids took the quiz because we could see that the kids opened up lots of books, just like you would, I want to open this. Okay, now close it. Now I'm going to open up another one. And so then we were sort of monitoring how many books were checked out and opened, but not necessarily how many books were read. And so what did it actually provide us? I don't know if it was better. In fact, I'd say it probably wasn't. I'd say we should have been bringing kids this was a resource-rich district. So MyOn Reader may have been perfect for a district that had low resource in terms of they didn't have libraries. They didn't have librarians or media specialists. We did. And so we just decided that this was going to be better because it was technology. And so we weren't really clear on what our goal was. And so I would say that's maybe what James Lane would be saying is it's got to be newer, and better means it's getting you closer to the goals that you have established as a community.
I can so relate. That makes perfect sense to me. I remember in probably middle school, maybe high school, when I was teaching middle school or high school, the language around the conversation about instruction was always like, especially in language arts, was we teach this book, we teach that book. And my stance, and this is probably why I left in teaching to go to administration, was I'm like, we don't teach books, we teach kids. And the book is a vehicle for understanding a concept that we are trying to have students understand at this particular grade level. That's the point. It doesn't matter that it's this book or that book, no matter how much I like it. There are tons of books I loved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what we're doing, but I would fall in love with them, right? So the one I always talk about is The House on Mango Street. Man, I had a crush on Sandra Cisneros. Like I remember meeting her in person and me almost falling all over myself. But just because Jamie likes the book, I then went looking to see what are the concepts that had to be taught that could connect to the standards, et cetera, as opposed to the other way around.
I'm seeing what are kids talking about? What are they interested in? What's impacting their lives right now? What is historically relevant in this moment? And House on Mango Street is a great example of community and family and identity and culture. And so it's likely that the book would fit if, in fact, your kids were driving that decision. Yeah, I would say every year I kept seeing, was it Charlotte's Web? It was like, oh my God, Charlotte's Web again? Maybe that's valuable. Yet I would believe that kids would be bringing in lots of different stories about what's happening in their lives. And then we as educators, working in partnership with our media specialists, our librarians, or reading Horn Book or School Library Journal, or finding what are the books that are really speaking to a child's experience now, and then certainly aligning it to the standards that you have to teach.
Exactly. And that's so picking whatever you pick.
Yeah. So the book needs to be new book and better.
Yeah.
Not just
exactly. Otherwise,
good
stick
book.
With it. Yeah.
And if it's unrelated. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. So I really appreciated that he joined us, that he talked about his work, that he really spoke to innovation and the initiative fatigue that people have, and why you then move forward with innovation as long as it's newer and better. And then looking at leadership as this getting better. So this getting better really seemed to be the theme that I kept hearing, was that one individual is never going to be perfect. And yet together as a team and giving yourself that grace and your team that grace, like good things will happen for you, for your district, and for your community.
That is the work, isn't it? Being able to give grace, to not get caught up in the stuff that's so difficult about working across difference. That when people are different from you, that is an amazing gift that helps you be a better leader. And they're different from you. So it's going to rub you wrong. You're going to be like, wait, why do you think of it that way? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Learning from those mistakes rather than being paralyzed by the fear of being wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Anyway,
all right.
That was wonderful.
Good. Yeah. All right. I will see you next week, Jamie.
You and I. Yeah. So good.
Yeah.
Cool. I loved it. James, just so you know, we're basically the same person saying, yeah, it was good. Good job. Keep working.
Well, it was very good. And I love the fact that he knew so many of our previous guests, like Stephen Pruitt and others. So it was really
Oh, gosh.
all right.
There's another one. Go listen to Stephen Pruitt. Amazing.
You've been listening to an Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Manson, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, we will.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.